Hi everyone, my name is Funké Aladejebi and I'm currently an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. And a lot of my work centers on Black Canadian history and Black life in the 20th century Canada. Part of my desire to specialize in the area of Black Canadian history was a result of the absence of the Black presence in a lot of historical literature and a lot of data and evidence around and in Canadian history itself. And so in some ways, I really got increasingly interested in it as a way to understand myself, but also as a way to better support my students who were trying to get a sense of what life was like for persons of African descent in the 17th, 19th, 20th centuries. And so it really was trying to get a sense of why there was this ongoing absence of the experiences of persons of African descent. And it was also a way of thinking through who I was as a scholar, as an educator, trying to make sense of these broader systems of erasure. And so my desire really started through that. And one of the important avenues that was through was a largely around education. So I became increasingly interested in education and the way that Canada's curriculum largely erased persons of African descent from the story. And so part of this was to try and get a sense of why that was the case. What are the broader systems of anti-Black racism that were embedded into our social, political, and education systems that did this, that allowed for this erasure to take place for so long. And so really that was my desire. That's what really started this ongoing research to try and better understand and speak to these absences and silences, but also to speak to this long-standing history of persons of African descent in Canada. I think I originally got interested in this because I knew I wanted to tell Black stories. I knew I wanted to tell stories about Black life and connected to education systems. But as I mentioned, as a result of these ongoing absences and limited literature on persons of African descent in Canada, I became increasingly focused on oral history as a way of speaking to these absences, as a way of documenting and telling the stories of Black populations from an incredibly diverse perspective, and trying to also give space for the orality of that existed in Black communities, the way that Black people tell stories, the way that Black people articulate their family histories, their lived histories, became part of a way of thinking through all of those subjects. And I think that Black life in Canada is incredibly intersectional. And so as a result, I kind of constantly move in and out between conversations of gender, between conversations of oral history, between conversations of Canadian education, because they are so intricately connected, that in order to understand why education became so important to Black communities, you also have to understand the ways in which Black communities thought about their oral histories and their oral traditions. You also have to understand the legacies of gender, particularly women, in preserving cultural and community ties. And so those things kind of just came hand in hand. And the reason why transnationalism becomes so important in my analysis and the way that I think about transnationalism is that Black populations in Canada, not just from a migratory stance, the way in which they've moved across the diaspora in different geographic spaces, but I define transnationalism as the movement of not just people, but the movement of ideas, of cultural artifacts and cultural ideologies into different geographic spaces. And I talk about the way in which those contributions deeply, deeply impact different landscapes. So in the Canadian context, it's incredibly important that persons of African descent contributed at the inception of the way that Canada was developing as a nation. Structures, right? Structures of education, structures of colonialism, structures of slavery and enslavement. And all of that becomes part of this transnational emphasis and focus that I think sometimes gets lost because we often don't think of Canada and the Canadian context as a colonial space. Sometimes we don't think of it as a space that had its own processes of enslavement. And so my desire to connect to transnationalism is to talk about the way that persons of African descent have always been connected to this transnational, this global space where their ideas, where cultural practices, where community ties, kinship connections had moved across geographic space for centuries. And so transnationalism helps me to think through the way that Black people have always been thinking about themselves in relationship to a broader global system of not just the Black Atlantic, but of connected networks with each other. And so in a lot of ways, my work seems to constantly think through this interdisciplinary perspective to give weight to some of that, to give space to the ongoing impact that Black people have had to this global world. In my book, Schooling the System, a huge part of the analysis and my argument is to talk about the way that Black women really were and structured the early foundations of anti-racist education, of multicultural education in Canada. And one of the ways that they did that was through something called resistive pedagogies, that even amidst Canada's curriculum that largely erased the stories, the lives, the contributions of Black people in Canada, Black women made it a point to give weight, to give space for Black life, to talk about these ongoing legacies and their contributions into a curriculum that largely ignored Black people. So resistive pedagogies could be something that women did in really small, minute ways, or they could also be broader systemic changes to insert Black life, to insert Black presence into the Canadian curriculum. And sometimes it happened in these individual classroom structures, and sometimes it happened in the creation of larger Black studies programs. And so I was trying to, as much as possible in the book, to give more nuance to the way in which Black women contributed to some of these forms of resistive practice, both in the style of teaching, but also in the kinds of things that they taught. So I found in particular that really in the turn of the 20th century and also in the post-World War II period, Black women specifically were used as cultural mediators, that they really functioned as this go-between between Black community members and Canadian educational institutions. And they sought really aggressively to try and create this tie and link between Black communities to better understand education systems and to make Black students belong in schooling structures. And they also expanded this notion of anti-racist discourse to also include a diverse range of students. They were including all racialized students. They were including white students in the conversation to talk about what it meant to have a more inclusive structure where Black people were at the center of the conversation. And so the work is really trying to think through Black women's contributions in this way. And it also is thinking through their contributions external to institutional structures. So I found that a lot of the Black women that I spoke to also very much participated in various after-school programs, various, Saturday and weekend programs. And one of the more important organizations that I talk about is a program called the Black Education Project. And it really was supported by many Black women teachers who really saw themselves as combating these broader systemic challenges in Canada's education system by creating these additional programs that specifically centered on Black affirmation, the education of Black students from an equitable approach, and really an emphasis on Afrocentric education and affirming Black life in really important ways. So it really is, I think, in the work Schooling the System, is trying to think about Black women's multiple diverse contributions to the Black Canada space, but also to the Canadian landscape as a whole, that they were constantly in conversation with each other, responding to Canadian curriculum, responding to the absences, and also creating more inclusive projects where Black students could see themselves and where other racially diverse populations could see themselves reflected in the curriculum. I'm really excited about Unsettling the Great White North because of its potential, but also because it's covered so many contributors. There are 21 chapters, 23 scholars that are in this edited collection, and it really was a collaborative project, and it stemmed from the desire from Professor Michelle Johnson at York University and I, and our constant challenge that we had teaching African Canadian history, and the constant requests that we had from students about whether or not there was any new scholarship on Black Canadian history, what was out there, how was the field developing. And so in order to kind of give us a sense, right, of the more updated, the more critical conversations and the incredible incredible expansion of the field of Black Canada, we thought that this would have been the perfect way to do that. And so the volume itself includes contributions both from a thematic and chronological perspective. It thinks through the methodologies, that is, how do we do Black Canadian studies and history? And it really thinks about this kind of diverse contributions that scholars in the field of Black Canada are engaging with, are thinking about. So it really was rooted in the request from students, from public community members who deeply, deeply desired accessible work on Black Canadian history and Black Canadian studies, and really trying to understand the development of the field as a whole, because so much of Black Canadian studies and Black Canadian history stands almost in isolation from other disciplines in sociology, for example, in history, in gender and women's studies. And so our desire in putting this volume together and getting so many different contributors was to talk about the depth and the breadth of the field, and to talk about the ongoing innovation in scholarship that has taken us to where we are now in the field, and in this, I think, more contemporary moment where people are becoming increasingly excited about Black Canadian history, about what it means to exist as a person of African descent in Canada from a geographic standpoint. So that's why the project happened, and it's why it leans so heavily on collaboration, because I actually think that's just how scholars of Black Canada write, is from an interdisciplinary approach, is from a way of contributing and thinking about different disciplines and how that all comes together to tell a more complex and nuanced story of Black Canadian history. It was both easy and incredibly difficult. You could imagine that even though we had 21 chapters and we have so many contributors, I don't think we've even scratched the surface of the development of the field and all of the scholars that are writing in Black Canada. But I think one of the things that we did was really to be intentional about the kinds of calls and the kinds of people that we were speaking to. So you'll notice that the scholars are not just based, for example, in Ontario. They're also in the East Coast. They're also in the West Coast. We're talking not just about Black Caribbean populations. We're also talking about Black African populations. We're also talking about Canadian-born Black populations. And it really is to give weight to the multiplicity of people who are doing work in the field and how their work might be related to history, but also might be connected to other disciplinary fields. So it was really exciting and incredibly difficult to try and get everyone to contribute to the volume, but to try and also categorize these concepts in important theoretical frameworks and important geographic frameworks. So in a lot of ways, I think the work really does embrace its title of Unsettling. It unsettles what we think Black Canada is supposed to be. It unsettles where we think Black Canada is going. It unsettles these broader ideas of resilience, of resistance, and it really tells a more complex story. And so I think it was an incredibly rewarding experience of intentional conversations with the contributors, of intentional pushback whenever scholars really wanted to ensure that we were representing the stories and their narratives in accurate ways. And so the work has been meticulously thought through in a way to give weight to the incredible scholarship that exists on Black life in Canada, but also to talk about the fact that scholars who write this work do incredibly rigorous and critical work. And so we were trying to think through all of these discussions all at once. And I think that the work itself really thinks about that. It thinks about citizenship. It thinks about labor. It thinks about education, gender, settlement, prison and cultural states. It thinks about all of these things. And I think that we leaned on that pretty aggressively, is that we leaned on trying as much as possible to give as much diversity to these stories, but to also talk about the way that anti-Blackness gets structured in Canada that also tends to lean towards moments of uniformity, why there are continuities over historical time periods, over geographic space that seem to affect the Black experience in Canada in a particular way. And so we try to give space for the variety, but also the uniformity of the way in which systems of Canada have been structured to erase Black people from the narrative. And so the work has been it's been humbling to think through all of the ways in which scholars think through methods, and to learn as we were putting this volume together. So I really had a great time. It was not easy. It took, this project is 3-4 years in the making. It started off with a project that we thought would work really quickly, and it took quite a bit of time to tell these stories in ways that I think are accessible to different communities of people. And so it's here, and I know Professor Johnson and I are incredibly excited about it, and but it did not come easily. That's for sure. I think I'll share the story from my co-editor, Michelle Johnson, who works specifically on Black women who were offered or were seeking positions as domestic workers at the turn of the 20th century, but also particularly in the 1950s and 1960s. And in Michelle Johnson's chapter, she looks through various legislation, orders in council, and immigration policy that really made a concerted effort to really resist the increasing movement of Caribbean women into the Canadian landscape. And what's really important, I think, about her chapter and the story is that she talks through the in-between phase of the first domestic scheme, which happened between 1910 and 1911, and then the second domestic scheme, which actually started between 1955 and 1967. And a lot of people talk about the second phase of the domestic scheme. It's the one that we know pretty in Black Canadian history because there's just more historical evidence. And so Professor Johnson thinks through the insertion of this in-between phase where really Canadian political officials, those who were from the Caribbean or parts of Jamaica, were really trying to ensure their own kind of political agenda, and that Black women were at the center of these conversations, that Black women were really trying to both use forms of labor and migration to gain access into Canada, but they also asserted their own rights and knowledge and expertise that were fundamentally important. And so I think why I like the chapter, Michelle Johnson chapters, not just because we're co-editors, but also because I think it tells a story about the historical elements that we don't know, the kinds of documents written by immigration officials that, haven't been released in earlier historical periods or looked at or analyzed in any critical way, but also the contributions from political and elected officials from parts of the Caribbean like Jamaica, who also advocated for Black women's migration into Canada. And this desire of connecting Canada and the Caribbean as part of this transnational Black experience that I think is really important. So it really is just about how Caribbean women created different lenses by which we can understand Black life, even amidst these conversations of labor, even amidst these conversations of gender and the anxieties that political officials had around Black women's reproductive and productive value, that I think is really just fascinating in terms of the historical context. And it tells a different story, a different lens by which we can understand a narrative that we think we know about Black Canadian history. And so that's one of the many contributors and stories that exist in this space. So I think that students, I think public audiences, I think other scholars will find Unsettling the Great White North fascinating for those kinds of stories that get implanted that we may not actually know about, that we may not have heard about, or that we revisit the sources already in existence to tell us a different kind of story about Black life. I hope first and foremost that students will see themselves as reflected in the scholarship and in the work itself. I think part of my desire of doing this work for the next generation of scholars is to give them the language to better understand both institutional structures, political structures, but also the historical continuities of anti-Black racism, of systemic forms of discrimination that deeply, deeply affect and impact persons of African descent. I also hope my work thinks through the incredible richness of Black Canadian history and Black Canadian studies and gets people excited about doing this work. I think there's been a long desire for scholars that do Black Canada to get everybody really excited about the really interesting and fascinating stories that exist in Canada. And so I think that that's what I hope my scholarship does, is to get students interested in the complex stories that can be told, in the complex methodologies that you can use to tell these stories. And I think it allows us to see the breadth and diversity of Black Canada as a whole. And so I think that that's what I like my work to do. From a practical sense, I hope that my work one, doesn't create more harm, but that it talks also about these intersectional moments and experiences, that in talking about Black Canada, that we think through different lenses by which we can tell that story, that we think through a gender lens, that we think through a class lens, that we think through interracial moments that affect our Black communities, that we think through just the complexity, that there doesn't need to be one way to understand, to do work, to do research on Blackness in Canada. And so I think my work really encourages that. And that's what I'd like to see the next generation of scholars do, is in much the same ways pick up on some of the work that not only I have done, but previous scholars who have explored Black Canadian studies and Black Canadian history, which I've learned incredibly and immensely from, and that they can build on these works and expand the field so that it really does become at the forefront of critical scholarship, of critical writing, of knowledge production itself. So I think those are the things that I'd like to see, or I hope that the work inspires. But at the root and the core, I think I'd like my work to help students understand themselves, to help scholars and persons of African descent and community members have the language by which to name these broader systems and their engagement with their community more as a whole.